Hello everybody. So I see a lot of questions about needles, what needles people use, what people's, how to tell what needles you have and what they are and all of that stuff. And, there are patterns that will say to use a 26 or a 28 or, whatever needles. And sure, that's a good suggestion because it will make holes in your fabric depending on what size needle you have. So if you see this hole right here, that was because I used a 24 needle on an 18 count Ada, and it did make the hole slightly bigger. Now this section in here has been stitched with, I think this section here was all stitched with that same 24 needle, and you can't see the holes once it's been stitched, but it does move the fabric. These sections here were stitched with a 26, and there's really no difference in what you can see where the corners are. So, it's not something that necessarily has to be stressed about. Now on my current project here, I am using a double-ended needle, which is good for two-handed stitching because you come out and the floss is in the middle of the needle. And normally I use a 26 needle when I'm stitching. This one's a 24, which does make that slightly bigger hole because, let me pull this over so I can hold this. Because as the thread is being pushed through the fabric, the thread is being slid alongside of the needle. Like that. And it will fatigue the floss as it's being pulled through the fabric. So I do like to make a slightly bigger hole by using a 24 double-ended needle. I have smaller ones, and I found that they're more fragile and they have less strength, and then they tend to break at the eye for these double-ended needles. But these are nice because then you can push it through with your less dominant hand, and with your more dominant hand in the back you can bring it forward. So like, I'll push it through with this end, and then holding all of the floss out of the way, I can bring it back up. Oh, find the right hole. There you go. I can bring it back up with my non-dominant hand and pull it through. Okay. So, that is a thing that we can do. Now when I'm using one of these, you want to make sure you're not stabbing your floss. So I try to make sure I pull all the floss out of the way as I'm putting it back in the hole. And this just helps to a couple things, it makes it easier so I can just go back and forth really quickly with the double-ended needle without having to do the traditional thing where you push it down and then in the back you would spin it and bring it back up, which can twist the floss. Now when I get to the back of my fabric and I'm bringing it back up, and I'm bringing it back up, I'll make sure that the floss is out of the way, and I'll just grip it like this. So behind my fabric, all of my floss is out of the way, so I'm not jabbing through. So the other thing with needles is there's a ton of different brands. So for my double-ended needles, I cut the cards so they fit in my little box. my little box. And I just write what size it is right on there, front and back. So that way I don't have to worry about what I'm doing. Let's move this out of the way. I need 2 hands. All right, put this down. So let me move this out of the way. There we go. Okay. So I keep all my needles stored in this little Estee Lauder makeup thing I got when I was like 20, so like 20 years ago. So there's my double-ended needles. And then in kits, you sometimes get needles that are, this one came from a kit I got on the Stitcher's Escape Cruise to Alaska with Gene Farish, 2025. And the kit came with a needle and it says the name brand. And she wrote the size on there. Now, this one either came from Fox and Rabbit or Gene Farish. I'm not sure which kit it came in. Sometimes you get needles that are just in a little thing and you don't know what they are. So in here, this was for a beading project that I did. And they gave me this very tiny little needle. And somehow I'm supposed to get floss through that tiny little hole there. That is not a big hole. I would say that hole is maybe 2 millimeters. 2 millimeters. And that's like half, quarter, about 1/8 of an inch. That hole is about 1/8 of an inch. That's a tiny, tiny little hole. I'm not trying to deal with that. So I don't use these for beading. I use different needles for beading. For beading, I use these long-eyed needles. I just got this on Amazon. I don't even know the brand. It's some weird Amazon brand. Because the whole needle is an eye. Problem with these is the ends are basically just where the 2 ends of the wire, let me get you in camera here. These 2 ends of the wire are fused together, so at the very tip here it can snag. It's not smooth, so I only use these for beading, and they're really nice for beading. And then you've got the stitching needle here also in that little packet. Okay, I don't even know what size it is. It's probably a 26. It's probably not even the one that came with the kit. My mother likes this brand. Okay, and these are the Singer, this side, are the Singer tapestry needles. And they're color-coded, which is great for beginners, because then you can see what by the color what size gauge it is. And then what I did with the other half of this is I put my other needles in here, and the sizes are not accurate for this. Well, they might be, but this is just where I store my needles. So these would be 28s, this would be 26s, and this would be 24s. So, you know, even if you don't like the Singer needles, this is a really great storage option for your needles, so you can see what brand or what size they are if, you know, you just want to keep them all together. And I don't use a lot of 22s. It's just really thick. It does come in handy for the 22s if you're doing something like Krynics that are thicker and you're just using a single strand. Now these are a John James 26, And this is a brand that I do like. The eyes are smooth. They don't catch on the floss. They're not stamped, so the eyes are smooth, which is nice because then it doesn't fatigue your floss. The DMC ones are probably my least favorite when it comes to the being stamped, because they have a horrible edge. If you look, you can see that little burr inside of the eye there. It's really hard to see. And that can fatigue your floss. And usually, like, this end is smoother. So you're going to want, when you have a needle that is stamped, you're going to want to look for the smooth end. And then that is where you're going to want to thread the floss through. So you would put the needle threader through the end with the burr, so the floss is coming through on the smooth end. Because like I said, this side had the burr. So if I put the needle threader in this way and pulled the floss through in this direction, it's going to snag the floss, which could damage your floss. And if you're using a delicate floss like a satin floss or a silk floss, for example, you're going to have that issue of snagging. So this one here, let's take a look at that one. That one's a relatively smooth eye. And you can more see it in person, more so on a video. Videos do not give a good description. I got a little bit of permanent marker on there from when I was organizing my flosses into baggies earlier. Okay, let's get these back in. Okay. Alright. So other types of needles. See, this is a 28 gauge double-ended needle, and you can just see how floppy that is. See how floppy that is compared to the 24. It's way floppy. And I've actually had one of these break in half. So if you're going to use a double-ended needle, I do not suggest the 28 unless you're going to be really, really delicate with it. The eye is smaller, so you're going to want to make sure that you're using, you know, just one single thread with that, you know. But it is a nice needle. It's just, I'm just not delicate enough. And then I've got this brand, which is a Perman needle. This is a 20 gauge, and this is one of the ones that I use for my Krynics and metallics, because this is a giant needle. And you can see that the eye is a smoother eye. But this is a giant needle. I normally use a 26 needle. And you can just see the difference here. So there, you know, this is what I use for Krynics. This is what I normally use for floss, is a 26. And I really like this brand of needle. They're smooth, they're comfortable to hold, they don't have a weird texture when I'm holding them. I got these at a needlework shop in Monroe, Michigan, which is down by the Ohio border, just north of Toledo, Ohio, called Riverview Stitching. You know, it's a beautiful shop. It's an actual cross-stitch shop. Now, this needle here is a yarn needle. Now, if you're teaching a young child how to cross-stitch, you can use one of these plastic yarn needles with, like, a 10 count fabric possibly, or plastic 7 count plastic canvas is usually what this would work with. Just a matter of if this eye is going to go through. I just keep it in my needle thing so I know where it is. This is a jewelry making needle, and it's for beading, and it's just one long piece of wire. Obviously, this is not going to go through your fabric. What I do with this needle here is I use it for making my beaded tool fobs, for example, but I also use it for when I'm working with my beads, which I brought some beads from my last project. And what I'll do is I will just start loading up this needle. And I usually do this in a tray. And I'll just load up this needle with the bead that I'm using. Doobie-doo. Let me get a couple on there. Okay, so I usually put like, you know, however many I need, or just a bunch on this needle, because once they're on this needle, I can take this and by this little plastic tab here, grab one of my needle minders and stick it on my mag board, or of course I grabbed a white one so you can't even see the beads there. Is that better? Yeah, not really. Okay, anyways, so I'll put this on like that, and it'll hold my beads for me while I'm stitching. And then with my double-ended needle, or my large-eyed needle for beading, put my floss on it. Of course I have a piece of floss here, so I can put my floss on it. And I don't actually need a threader for this needle. Look at that. So it'll hold my floss, 2 strands. And then I can take my beads on this beading wire needle. Okay. This is really hard to do when you're looking through a camera lens, just so you know. And then I've got my wire needle, my needle with floss, the bead, and then they come through on the other end. And then I hold the bead, pull it to the end like that, and then I got my bead on my floss. This makes it really easier for, you know, getting your beads from the packet onto your floss for when you're doing bead work. And you saw how easy that was to just go through these double-ended needles. And they're nice and flexible. There's like no... Wait, let me grab my tweezers. So it works really well, because with some of our tapestry needles, you gotta fight to get the tapestry needle through these little Mill Hill beads, and then you break your eye. So while we're talking about breaking the eyes of the needles, put this back on here so I don't lose it. So while we're talking about the eyes of the needles, you know, your pin cushions are a great thing. Sewing needles, tapestry needles, counting needles, which are really just sewing needles. I've got tapestry pins and counting pins. So this is my at-home covered with dog hair. I have a husky pin cushion. I got this at a yard sale for $2. Okay. Don't need that anymore. Don't need this anymore. So in here, in my working box, I have this little pin cushion, and I thought I had a damaged needle. Well, this is a damaged needle. This needle is damaged because I closed it in my travel box. But I have a needle somewhere, and it's a Singer 28 gauge needle. I may have thrown it out. And the eye is terribly bent. I don't know where it is. I think I threw it away. So another needle that you can get en masse is these gold lacquered needles. Where's my black thing at? See the gold? This one here is just a bulk cheap needle from Amazon. They work fine, but they are stamped, so they have that edge in there, which I don't like. The Singer needles, which my mother likes, and good on her, they feel weird because of the paint on the end. And they feel weird because this paint on the end changes the texture. And I personally don't like that. But, you know, when you're looking at your needles, it really just depends on your preference. I prefer a 26 because they're somewhat stronger than a 28. This is a colonial needle. It's a 28 tapestry petites. Package of 10 for $3.50. These colonial needles I really like too, as much as a John James. But you see this size difference here? 28 petite. So there is, these are the needles that I use when I do the thread chicken, are these little 28 needles. They're so much shorter. The problem is, if you look at the 28, how small the eye hole is, and they bend super easy. Come here. They bend super easy when you're pulling them through the fabric. So that's something to be mindful of with these 28s. Sure, they're smaller, and the 28 petites are super short in comparison, but they're more delicate. So you just have to be more careful when you're pulling them through the back of your fabric. So if I'm using something like that and I'm pulling it through the back of my fabric, I get out my angled needle noses, I'll grab it on the fabric and just pull it with the fabric until it comes out. So that way I'm not doing this thing with my fingers as I'm trying to get it out of my fabric where I'm lifting up and pulling. That's when you do all the fatigue on your eye holes, is when you're doing that pulling. This is a really long video on needles, but I hope that explains needles to people. You know, you can use whatever size needle you want. You just have to be aware with the smaller the number, the larger the needle gets. So it's going to open your fabric up more. But it also is better for certain flosses. So while I normally use a 26, if I'm working with satin floss, I'll use a 24 because the satin floss is a bit thicker. If I'm using a Krynic, sometimes I have to use the 20s or the 22s because the Krynic is a thicker floss and it's a single strand. If you're using the 28s, you just have to be aware that the 28 is a smaller hole and more delicate, and it can in fact cause floss fatigue if you're constantly sliding the needle up and down your floss. It also doesn't open the holes up wide enough, so if you're using a really stiff material and you're not opening that hole up on your fabric, if you're not opening the hole up on your fabric and you're using, like, let's say you're doing a 40 count or 20 count Aida and it's a really stiff fabric and you're trying to slide your floss through with a 28 needle so you don't spread your fibers of your fabric out, you're going to be rubbing on your floss, which will cause floss fatigue, which can cause breakage, thinning, fraying, and all kinds of other things with your floss. So, I mean, you just have to figure out what works best for you. A lot of people hate these double-ended needles because they do take some practice to get used to. And like I said, if they don't open up the hole wide enough, it can cause floss strain. So I hope that helped people who have questions about their needles. What needle should they use? What needle do they have? I mean, the size doesn't really matter. It's just important to keep a variety around so that way you know what works best for you. I mean, like you can see here, even on this thing that I have, all of these needles have a different look with their eye holes. So, you know, I don't use just one needle. I keep a variety of needles with me no matter where I'm going. This one's probably a 28. Oh, this is my bent one. That's my very, very bent one. So then this one here is just a regular, this is probably a beading needle that came with one of my kits. And I don't like them because who's trying to thread that? I'm not trying to thread that. And I have a little tiny needle threader. I've got this little hummingbird threader with a cutter on it. And I don't even like trying to thread this into one of those little beading needles because it'll break the floss as you're trying to pull it through. This is like the cutest threader either. I like these standard stainless steel threaders. You know, they hold the needle, they hold the thread, they work great, and they're not fitting in those little beading needles. Anyways, thank you so much if you stuck to the end. I do appreciate it. If you have any questions, let me know. If there's any topics you want me to discuss from my own opinions, I will gladly make a video for you. Have a wonderful stitching evening, afternoon, morning. Good night, y'all, and bye.